Hi there, you've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. I recently had a conversation with Dr. Braxton Hunter, who is a very wise person, very heavily involved in Christian apologetics, and he had some wisdom nuggets to give us about free will, determinism, and this idea of libertarian freedoms. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to him, and I think the next 14 minutes will be well worth your time. I want to ask you before I forget, can I ask you about this free will argument that you said? Because I don't know if, I don't think I've heard that. So.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah, I'll kind of break it out for you now. I'll say right from the jump, and I don't know where you stand on secondary issues, but there are many Calvinists who would, I don't know if you're a Calvinist, but there are many Calvinists. Oh, okay. Well, then you'll probably be fine with it.
But, I'm a Molinist. If I had to pick something, I'd say I'm a Molinist.
Great. Okay, great. I'm a Molinist. I don't use Molinism to answer any soteriological questions, though I used to, but I'm a Molinist because I believe indirectly the Bible strongly implies that God knows what would have happened under other circumstances. But
so just to note what a Molinist is, a Molinist believes that God knows what we will, what we would, and what we could do under various circumstances. And that's been evidenced many times in the Bible. There's an example with David and Saul at one point where David went into a city and Saul was going to bar up the city. And God said, if David were to stay in the city, that Saul actually would do some certain things. And so David decided he would flee. God knew what Saul would do. And Jesus also has shown some examples of when he knew what somebody would do under various circumstances. So let's continue.
Anyway, with the free will argument, not many Calvinists may be able to use this, but it revolves around the question of whether determinism is true or libertarian freedom is true. Compatibilism is often considered to be a middle of the road between determinism, which just says no free will, and libertarian freedom that says free will, that you could have done other than whatever you ended up doing, and or nothing external to you determined your actions. So compatibilism is often thought to be in the middle, and Matt Dillahunty, until my debate with him, had always said he was a compatibilist. Daniel Dennett is a compatibilist. But compatibilism is determinism. So you can still think binary about this. There's only two options on the table: determinism or libertarian freedom. Compatibilism just uses the language of freedom and points out that we're free within the realm of our nature, but every action you take is determined. So you got determinism and libertarian freedom. So the argument would be, if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. All right. So that's premise one, and I'm ready to defend it. And then premise two is libertarian freedom does exist. And then the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. Now, it's similar to Craig's moral argument, which says if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Now, there Craig has the understanding that most people are going to grant premise two, that objective moral values and duties do exist. Likewise, in my argument, I'm granting that, and I have the data to support that the vast majority of the population believes they have libertarian freedom, whether they know that's what to call it or not. So premise two, with the average population, is going to be uncontroversial and is really the strength of the argument. With academically minded determinists, they're not going to grant premise two, and so I have to defend premise two as well. So to run through it again, if God does not exist, libertarian freedom does not exist. Libertarian freedom does exist, therefore God exists. So I would defend those, and real briefly, I'll just kind of show you how I would defend those. So I would defend those with premise one: if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. It seems that most of the atheist determinists out there would actually grant me this premise. They may not be willing to grant that if God exists, it would allow for libertarian freedom, but they will grant, most of them, I think it's like 70-something%. There was a study of philosophers and their perspectives that I quote in several episodes. If you want the direct stuff, it's in the first response I did to Matt Dillahunty. That's just me without my co-host. But I gave all this data and quoted the journal articles. But most of your atheist determinist philosophers, are determinists, which seems to lend credibility to the idea that if you're an atheist, you're more than likely going to be a determinist. And if you're not an atheist, you're more than likely going to not be a determinist, because the vast population isn't atheistic and it does believe in libertarian freedom. So they're with me on this. If God does not exist, then the universe is a natural system of cause and effect. There is no ghost in the machine. If naturalism is true, it is all just causal, normal causal relations. And so there just isn't a way to get libertarian freedom. There are some people out there that are arguing that quantum physics might be able to supply you with an opportunity and all that. But for the most part, it seems understandable and somewhat non-controversial that if there is no God, you don't have libertarian freedom. All right. So premise one, I think, is pretty secure, and I've got some other defenses for it, but for time's sake, I think premise one's pretty good. Premise two, that libertarian freedom does exist. Now there, I was criticized by Dillahunty, or characterized by him after the debate as having said, well, it just has to be true because I so feel that it is true, which wasn't at all, wasn't at all what I was saying. The reason he thought that, and I'm sorry if I'm sucking all the air out of the room, I'm trying to make this brief.
No, this is great.
Okay, so with free will, with the libertarian freedom, one of the reasons, and I think the reason he got that impression is, Richard Swinburne, in his argument from religious experience, uses what's called the principle of credulity. And the principle of credulity is the idea that if something seems to me almost impossible to doubt, then I'm justified in holding it until such a time as overwhelming evidence is presented to show me that I'm wrong. Now, Dillahunty called that a fallacy in the debate, but it simply isn't a fallacy. And if it is a fallacy, he committed the same fallacy moments later when he said, I think that I exist. I have this, overwhelming sense that I exist. And I think I'm justified in that until someone gives me overwhelming reason to think that I don't exist. So, but anyway, so I do think that. I think I have this almost impossible to doubt sense that I have libertarian freedom. Until someone gives me overwhelming evidence that I'm wrong, I'm going to keep believing that, and I'm justified and have a warrant in believing that. That's one thing. The second thing is, if libertarian freedom does not exist, then rational affirmations cannot exist. And here's what I mean by that. Rationality is related to reason. And it has to do with this concept that rationality or reason is the process by which we think about data that's coming in. We think about things that we're considering, and then we choose which thing we should affirm instead of something else. But what people don't understand is that if determinism is true, it's not just your actions that are determined, but even your thoughts and beliefs are determined as well. So that you have no justification for rationally affirming anything that you believe. You can affirm things, but you can't rationally affirm them. And if you can't rationally affirm them, you may be right, but you can't know that you're right. And so knowledge claims are gone. And there's a great analogy from Tim Stratton on this. He says, imagine that right now you discovered that there's a mad scientist who is determining your every thought, action, and beliefs, including the next words that are coming out of your mouth and what you're thinking right now as I'm talking. If you found out a mad scientist was determining all of that, would you have any justification for believing or trusting anything that you say or think? You wouldn't, because someone else is controlling your thoughts. On determinism, on naturalistic atheism, it's even worse than that, because there's not even a mad scientist. It's just the random, unguided processes of the universe. So all that to say, if you take determinism to be true, you can't have rational affirmations. But we think we can have rational affirmations. So determinism is probably false. And then lastly on that, I would say that if determinism is true, it results in what we call moot morality. Whether or not you think objective morality exists or not, if determinism is true, you can't help but to do whatever you're doing. So if you become a benevolent, person who goes and builds wells for thirsty people in some third world country, or you become a racial hater, in either case, you're doing what you were determined to do and could not have done otherwise. So you can't hold anyone morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. But we all know that morality is not moot in that way, and no one lives their life like that. So determinism's out and libertarian freedom is in. So the argument, I think, goes through and God exists.
I like that argument. And I wanted to piggyback on some of your points there, because I think the idea of libertarian freedom is also the idea that I'm going to take accountability for my own actions. Right. And I feel like determinism, biological determinism, and I've read some of that with Sam Harris's book. And I think Daniel Dennett mentioned some of this whole idea with biological determinism. But it's the idea of taking away accountability for some of your actions and trying to pretend that everything's been predetermined in your cells. And I can agree to a certain extent. Like when you learn to walk, for example, some of the things that you memorize, you learn to pick up a spoon, you learn to eat and that kind of thing. I think those very low level skills that people learn are, there's some determinism a little bit in that, but then going to the higher level of reasoning, as you mentioned, that's where I am a libertarian free person who believes in the freedom of
I think
actions.
you hit on a really relevant point here. One of the great evidences that determinists will trot out to defend the position of determinism are what are called Libet experiments. This guy ran an experiment where he showed that, and that modern iterations of it use two buttons in front of a person, and they say, choose which of these buttons you're going to pick. And the light above that button will go off before the person clicks it, presumably showing that we were able to determine what you were going to do by brain activity before you even became aware of which thing you were going to choose. Therefore, free will does not exist. But Libet himself, the original guy who came up with this and ran the original experiment, said, yes, but what we found was that there is, I forget the numbers, but let's just say 300 millisecond window where you can refrain from choosing. So perhaps there is some determinism in the sense that you're about to choose something, but then you have this, I forget what he called it, but this refusal period where you can refrain and not do what you were about to do. I think this makes so much sense of biblical Christianity because we have a nature that prompts us to do certain things, but we can refrain from those actions. So maybe you don't think we have free will, but according to the Libet experiments, you do have free won't, which means you have free will. So you can choose not to do a certain thing. So I think that's really powerful and gets left out of a lot of these discussions.
Yeah, I like that. In free won't. I agree with a lot of those points. And I'm just trying to think of some of the other things that I wanted to mention on that same level, and I'm forgetting.
Yeah, and while you're thinking that through, I could just add really quickly this, that there is a serious difference, and you hit on it, between picking, what we could call picking, and choosing. If I'm picking which button to push, or I'm picking, whether I'm going to have, orange juice or water, I'm picking, these are not really high level deals, but choosing where I'm really, who am I going to marry? What am I going to do with my life? How am I going to respond to what she just said? These are not the same as those low level cognitions. I'm actually wrestling with this and trying to determine, and that's a whole different thing. And Libet experiments don't even approach this issue of choosing. So I would just add that to the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's good. That reminds me of, that actually was what I was going to say. I was thinking about mental models and schemas and this idea of cognitivism, and the idea that as you grow older, initially you start out with very simple mental models, and you grow older, things become more sophisticated and your reasoning becomes more sophisticated. And so at that point you get to the choosing level, you're at the higher level of reasoning. And so then I think trying to make an argument that we're determined at this very high level, to me, it doesn't make any sense.
Sure, yeah.
Sorry for the Calvinists if they feel.
No, that's okay. And honestly, what every non-Calvinist and libertarian person that I'm aware of would say is we do have strong influences in this world. So if I addict myself to nicotine, that is going to be a strong influence that is going to really make it difficult for me to actually give up that nicotine. But now that is actually a difference between a different thing from having free will. Oftentimes people will say, look, you've got a man's nature. You can't freely choose to fly like a bird. You don't have a bird nature. Well, now that's true. I can't actually fly like a bird, but I can freely will to fly like a bird. I can say my will is to fly like a bird, whether I can do it or not. So this is a very deep discussion, and it's one of my favorite things. Actually, the way I arrived at it is I used to do debates with Calvinists within theological circles. I have 4 debates with Calvinists on my channel that people can go check out. And my co-host has a debate on Calvinism. But I felt like I really needed to be focusing on evangelism toward people that are not yet believers. And so I left that, but then I prayed and asked God, and I really believe this is an answer to prayer. I asked God to reveal to me some way that I could use the knowledge I'd gained from the Calvinism debates for apologetics toward atheists. And I think this free will argument was an answer to that prayer.
And I agree. I agree with that idea. I think that that is an answer to the prayer. I think he does an excellent job of articulating his views. I wanted to add to one thing that he mentioned, this idea of theological versus biological determinism. So atheists endorse biological determinism, stating that what's in their minds has already been determined basically through their genes. And then Calvinists adapt the idea of theological determinism, and the theological determinism idea is saying that God has predestined us in certain paths, and so therefore we can do nothing to change the predestination that God has made us. But I believe that God gives us choice. He gave us free will. That's pretty specifically put out there in the Bible, when we can see all of the people in the Bible freely choosing their actions, sometimes trying to go against what God has willed for them. And many people have talked about even the name Israel, wrestling with God. People go against God's will. I've come into contact with a number of atheists who've also said, well, if God is omniscient, then he already knows what I'm going to do. Therefore, my choice to be an atheist, he already knew I would do that. But yet the argument there is saying that God is stuck in time as we are. God is not stuck in linear time as we are. God is concurrently in the past, present, and future. So when we say that God knows what you're going to do, it's because God already saw you doing it. He can look back on your life just as he can look forward to your life, because again, he's I am. He is concurrently past, present, and future. I want to thank all of you for coming here. I'm trying to build my channel. I'd like to get up to 1,000 subscribers. It would be super exciting if you would like and subscribe and share this video and my other videos with your friends. I'd greatly appreciate it. And thank you again for coming by. Thank you.